almost certainly seen them popping up on social media. The Vermeers, the Van Eycks, the Van Goghs, as the bored and the isolated recreate the old masters themselves in real life, using only what they already own.
And contrary to belief, this is not my normal clothes. In fact, it's my daughter's dungarees.
Launched by the Getty Museum in Los Angeles and inspired by a Dutch Instagram account, the aim is to recreate a famous work of art with just 3 household objects.
Did you ever expect that this challenge would be as big as it is?
Not in a million years. We've done social media challenges before and people enjoyed them, but this one just went gangbusters. We had no idea so many thousands of people around the world would get involved. We've just been thrilled by it.
What do you think it is about this challenge that's like so appealing right now?
I think it's a sense of community. We're not all Rembrandt, but we all can make something. We're all creative. And I think what people really enjoy is both the doing, but even more so seeing how clever other people are.
The results: hilarious, inspiring, and adorable.
It made me very proud seeing how close we got to a painting that was painted a very long time ago.
With the shop shut and nowhere to go, there's no choice but to use what you can find around the house.
Because I've been sitting on this comforter for like 2 weeks, just watching TV shows. So I was like, oh, this can be like this glorious piece of fabric.
Which is not to say it's easy.
So it took me about 2 hours to recreate this, but I work from home now, so I have time.
As the days in self-isolation turn to weeks, it's a global art project perfectly suited to our time. A bit of creativity for the quarantine era, where life is beginning to imitate art.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.